What's going on, y'all? It's your boy 3 Stacks in this thing. I have a very special treat for you. This is going to be a huge video segment. This is going to be very, very impactful, I believe, on the Yu-Gi-Oh community as a whole. This is something that someone asked me to do a while ago. This is known as the art of deck building. There is a huge science, and also there's even a mathematical aspect to the deck. There's a lot of problematic things that I want to touch up on, a lot of things that I feel as a whole the Yu-Gi-Oh community needs to improve on. In addition to that, there is basically a statistical thing about the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! It is a game of chance and also a game of skill. And on that aspect, I wanted to touch a lot of really sensitive topics and at the same time, basically teach you how to build a deck in a very, very good way, a well-balanced deck. It's not actually to be taken as an insult. It's not saying that everybody out there doesn't know how to build a deck, but for those of you who needing help and also want to learn how to build a really, really competitive deck and do well on a competitive scene, this video will help you and also give you an advantageous piece of knowledge to take and use to your advantage in all of your duels in the future. So I've broken things down into a category, but I'm going to start with the basic simple principle of building a deck. When you're building a deck, there are certain things you have to take into consideration. A being, what kind of playstyle do you want to go about with the deck? You can have an aggressive playstyle. You can have a control, which is technically a defensive playstyle. Aggressive being you want to get the game to finish fast, so you're trying to OTK. Defensive meaning you don't want your opponent to go off, so you want to build your deck to basically be restrictive, floodgate-ish, really, really oppressive and made to counter other strategies. That is actually my favorite strategy out of all. Since I've started playing the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! I played for actually 17 years. And out of all the strategies, I felt like control was my favorite one. C is also a well-balanced, a balance between the two, aggressive and defensive, meaning that your deck can control the game, but at the same time, at those certain scenarios, it can shine and really just kill you in one turn. And there's also an alternative where you could just build your deck to have fun, where you're not trying to win, you're not trying to do too good, you just want to enjoy your deck, and you want it to still do what you want it to do, meaning you want it to be consistent, right? There are also decks that are very, very, very search heavy and really reliant on drawing and searching and just deck thinning. There are a lot of consistent decks, and a lot of decks can be fun on that end because, they can kind of get the job done simply because they have so many ways and alternative methods to do the same exact thing. So there are a lot of different decks that you can build. But basically, this is going to be a 2-segment video. I want to let you guys know that this is part 1 of a 2-segment video. This is going to be very, very informational. So if you have the time, take a seat and watch the video. If you're a very, very busy man, you might want to set this apart to a watch later playlist and watch this when you have the time, because I don't want you to miss out on this. So how do you build a deck, 3 Stacks? If I want to build a deck, how do you make it good? You want to take into consideration the ratio of spells, traps, and monsters first and foremost. You want to play an even amount of each. You don't want to play too much of either unless you're going for a certain aspect of the deck. Most aggro and aggressive decks play a lot more monsters and a lot more spells than they do traps whatsoever. And most control decks play a bit more traps than they do anything else. And might play little to no spells whatsoever, and they kind of go for a protect the castle kind of playstyle, where you're summoning a monster and you're setting keeping loads of back row to protect that monster and just poke for damage. A barrier statue is a very, very similar basically playstyle to that. So there are a lot of mechanics to the game. Summoning mechanics do play a huge aspect in it as well. You can play a deck whose summoning mechanic is more focused on XYZ summoning, one who's more focused on link summoning, one who's more focused on synchro summoning, fusion summoning, or even ritual summoning or pendulum summoning. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different summoning mechanics. Tribute summoning included, that makes 7. So I guess I might as well just grab a masterpiece just to hold basically to be the face and pinnacle of that summoning mechanic. I picked a monster for each summoning mechanic to represent as a whole. So as you can imagine, I picked Herald of Perfection to represent rituals today. And for XYZs, I kind of picked some generic stuff. For links, I picked Double Helix just because powers are so popular. I could have picked, Firewall Dragon to represent them, but I guess we'll put Masterpiece there. So I'll say it like that. If you want your deck to be consistent and you want it to get the job done well, there are quite a few aspects that pertain to that. So if you want to build a consistent deck that is going to be aggressive If you want it to be aggressive, you probably want to play oppressive boss monsters such as Darklaw, such as Invoke Makaba, such as Cypher and Lord Omega, such as True King of All Calamity, such as Baguska the Terribly Tired Tapir, Masterpiece, Herald of Perfection, Blue Eyes Chaos Max. There are a lot of boss monsters that you can run in the game of Yugioh, but in order to be able to summon those monsters in a consistent manner and to ensure that you can always do so and not just do it once, but actually multiple times in the same duel, you want to run cards like these. I have these spells to represent a bunch of different playstyles, but basically these spells all do the same thing. They get you to the cards that you need, so they deck in and they dig for the combo pieces that you need. Now, field spells are a very, very popular way to actually dig through your deck. If you have a deck that can play field spells, you have a very, very high advantageous edge over most decks because field spells happen to be searchable by a spell known as Terraforming. Now, Terraforming is a great deck thinner, and at the same time, it's also a great card to bait out hand traps. Hand traps play a huge role, and we'll get to that when we get to that. But right now, we're talking about how to build a consistent deck. Now, Terraforming is here. So if you want to build a consistent deck, you really should focus on the basic principle that my sensei taught to me. 20 monsters, 10 spells, and 10 traps. What you have is a 40 card that plays an even amount of everything. The reason why you want to play 20 monsters is because what gets the job done more than anything is monsters herself. If you play every oppressive trap and every floodgate to shut your opponent and lock your opponent out of the game, and every spell that searches and digs through your deck and still don't play monsters, you're not going to get anywhere in the duel because you have no way to attack your opponent's life force directly. Granted, there are alternative playstyles such as Chain Burn that require for you to have no monsters and you can still win the game. Nonetheless, for the most part, monsters are honestly the most important cards in your deck because they are what you are trying to protect. They are what your opponent's trying to destroy. They are what attack the life points directly. Most monsters are the center focal point of the entire game. The aspect of Yu-Gi-Oh is playing spells to get you where you need to be, playing traps to protect the monsters that you summon, and using your monsters to attack your opponent directly. That is the simplified mechanic of the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Granted, it has advanced to a state where it's not that simple anymore, where it's not just attacking directly, it's actually become a, I'm gonna try to make this board and see if you can break it kind of thing. Nonetheless, the board you make is full of what? Monsters. Monsters can be destroyed by many things, but at the same time, there are a lot of monsters who offer protection. So my piece of advice to you, if you're playing if you're trying to play a consistent deck, follow the 20 monster rule, the 10 spell, and the 10 trap. Why do you want to play traps? You want to play traps because you need protection, because you're not always going to be going second. If you're going second, you can main deck cards such as Darkhold and Raigeki to give you an advantageous edge over the opponent, because if they make their board, one card from your hand can actually answer everything that they've dropped if the monsters can be destroyed. There are also alternative cards such as a Kaiju and also Raw Spear Mode, which tend to be side deck staples, but at the same time they can be main deck if you're crazy enough to do so. And you'd be surprised what people are willing to do and how far they're willing to go just to win the game. But with that said, that's the basic mechanic and principle for playing a deck and the ratio on what you want to play, 20, 10, and 10. Now, there are decks that can get away playing a lot more spells than traps, but you also have to keep in mind that your deck is a lot more susceptible now to cards like Anti-Spell, Imperial Order. There are cards that can negate spells and traps, and there are also cards that can stop you from searching, such as Droll and Lockbird. So if you want to play a deck that's focused on searching, just keep in mind that you want to play cards such as maybe Cypher and Gamma to be able to stop the opponent from stopping you with the cards such as Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, Ghost Ogre for your field spell, or even Droll and Lockbird to prevent you from searching. So if you're playing a deck that's susceptible to a certain card, such as Anti-Spell, what you want to incorporate into your main deck is cards that will shut that card down if you ever run into it. If you're playing a lot of back row and your opponent has back row hate, you might want to actually take in cards such as Starlight Road, which can actually protect your back row from being blown out by cards such as Twin Twisters and even Spiral Sleeper himself. Now, moving forward from that aspect, touching on the sensitive topic of hand traps. Hand traps are cards that, let me double check something. We are rolling on, all right, we're rolling on about nine minutes. Looking good so far. Hand traps are cards that actually can be played in any deck. So here is something that's really interesting. If your deck has a very small compact engine, you actually open up space for you to play such oppressive cards as Maxi, Gamma, Drone Lockbird, Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit, Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, and also Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries. Now, some hand traps are only good in certain metas, but then there are also hand traps such as Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, Ghost Ogre, and Gamma, who are kind of going to be good no matter what. Maxi sometimes wasn't even always good. When we were in the True Draco format, Maxi was not a very good card, and in fact, it was being side decked most of the time. But cards like Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, Ghost Ogre, and Gamma are always going to be good because no matter what, every deck plays cards that they can hit. Ghost Ogre can basically hit any spell trap or monster that's on the field. Ash can practically negate anything. And Gamma actually negates any monster effect, and every deck does play monsters. So I feel like these three hand traps are probably going to be good no matter where we go into the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! No matter where the meta goes and how the format, basically diversifies and adapts to certain situations. With that said, hand traps are just something that a lot of people don't like. But at the same time, when you play cards like these, you give your deck a higher ceiling exponentially. What is ceiling, 3 stacks? Ceiling is the ability for a deck to win by default based upon the cards that it plays. What does that mean? A card like Solemn Strike has a high ceiling, and when you play cards like that in your deck, you increase the ceiling of your deck. You increase its chance to win by default, whether you have a high skill level or not. And it is the way you play the card a lot of the time, but the fact that you have the card and it can be played does actually give you a huge combating edge in today's meta. Cards like Dark Law actually have high ceiling because just by default, this card can actually just win against a lot of decks because of how he shuts a lot of mechanics down. So when I say high ceiling, if you do not understand what that means, ceiling basically is the ability for something to win. A deck that has high ceiling could be, for example, Spirals. Spirals have such a high ceiling because if they can resolve their combo without any interference, they're more than likely going to either A, win the duel, or B, get so far ahead that now you're playing turns behind. Now, you can actually build your deck to actually counter certain decks like Spirals if you want to, but keep in mind that if you're building your deck to counter certain decks, you're not going to have a good matchup against everything. You'll only have a good matchup against that certain particular deck. If you play a random rogue deck such as Barrier Statue and every card you play is meant to counter Spirals, you might lose to that deck because you weren't actually ready for it. So another good piece of advice is keep in mind that you want to have versatility and also diversification in all of your decks. You want your deck to have a good matchup against everything, and you need to pay attention to its weaknesses. So what are weaknesses, 3 stacks? When you're playing a deck that, like I said, searches a lot, you're highly susceptible to cards like Droll. If you play a deck that focuses so heavily on the monsters, you are really lackluster in the form of protection, right? Because your monsters are your protection. So if your opponent is playing cards like Dark Hole, Raigeki, Kaijus, or even cards like Solemn Strike and Evenly Matched, you are at a huge disadvantage because your deck is so monster heavy. For example, a Heretic deck. What's another good example? What's a deck that plays a lot of monsters? One could say Burning Abyss plays a lot of monsters, but they can factor in other cards. But overall, as a whole, I would just say monsters and decks that play monster heavy, in general, are really weak to spells and traps. That's why it's very important to play a certain ratio of each. And also keep in mind, when you're playing a monster heavy deck, you do have an advantageous edge in the grind game because a lot of decks, when they come down to that top decking scenario, they need to top deck a monster. And when your deck is full of monsters, you have no problem with that. And at the same time, if they're playing cards that search them to get to their monsters, if you have a card like Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, you potentially stop them from ever seeing the monster in the first place, which is very, very detrimental. But at the same time, if you're playing a deck that's very trap heavy, such as Paleozoic, you have a huge advantageous edge over a lot of decks because, unfortunate but true, most decks do not actually play their decks built to counter back row because back row is not a very popular mechanic and also not a very popular playstyle, which is why a deck like Paleozoics does have a huge edge over a lot of decks. I'm just checking on the time limit of where I am at. As it stands, we're at 14 minutes in. I'm glad because there's a lot of stuff I want to touch. So, I brought Barrier Statue into the picture because Barrier Statue is actually something known as anti-meta. What is anti-meta? Anti-meta is actually a playstyle that's meant to counter other decks. It fits in the category, as I said, the B, which is control and or defensive, which means you're not really trying to kill your opponent in one turn. What you're trying to do is simplify the game state as much as possible. And by doing so, your opponent cannot aggressively push through your resources, and at the same time they can't really just walk all over you and trample over you and just kill you right away. What it comes down to now is your opponent really does have to play around the cards that you have, and that gives you such a huge edge because every single card is accounted for. When you play a card from your hand and that card gets answered by something that negates it, you have lost that card. And because each person starts with either 5 or 6 cards in your hand, each card actually counts. Your card advantage is one of the hugest things I want you guys to pay attention to. That's something also I want you to take out of this video. I know that I'm bouncing around to a lot of topics. There is no main focus except the art of deck building. And when you're building your deck, you're obviously building your deck to duel. So there's a lot of stuff you want to keep in mind. So card advantage is a huge thing too. It's actually the proper term is card economy. What you want to do as you're dueling, whether you build an aggressive, defensive, or even a balance between the two kind of deck, or even just a plain old anti-meta deck, you want to keep into account how many cards your opponent has in his hand and also how many cards you have in your hand. Why does that play such a huge contributing factor to the game 3 stacks? The reason being is because if your opponent has more cards in hand than you do, and you have maybe more cards on the field than your opponent does, if you simplify the game out, if your opponent answers to the monsters that you have on board, your opponent is basically winning at that point because you have so little resources in your hand that you more than likely cannot reestablish a somewhat viable board, which really would be detrimental to you because now your opponent has so many resources that they can really just kill you at the offset chance because you might not have the answers to the card that they have, because the less cards you have in your hand, the less likely you are to actually have the specific answer and out to what they have. So card economy is a huge thing, and that is why spells are probably the second most important cards in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! I think monsters are more important than spells because monsters are actually what win you the game a lot of the time, and hand traps actually happen to be monsters. So because hand traps are monsters, again, that is why I say monsters are more important than anything. But spells arguably could be the most important cards because spells are actually power plays. If you play a deck that can actually run good spells like these, for example, Pot of Desires, Duelist Alliance, Pre-Prep, Spellbook of Secrets, you know, the Spellbook engine, Terraforming, and Field Spells, you're playing a really consistent deck because these are actually additional extenders and quote-unquote additional ways to get you to the same exact cards that you're already playing at 3. What do you mean by that, 3 stacks? If I'm playing a card like Masterpiece in my deck at 2, and I'm playing spells like Terraforming and Diagram, I'm increasing my chances and odds of opening up into this card simply because I'm playing ways to search it out, which actually gives you an edge over a lot of other decks who can't play cards like that because now you're basically playing extra copies of the same card. So in technical terms, if you're playing 3 of a field spell and 3 of a Terraforming and the field spell searches a certain card, you actually have 6 extra copies of that card in your deck, which really can't come in handy in grind game situations when you need to draw a certain card and you happen to have more of that card than you do of any card in your deck, which really does help you. But also keep in mind that playing spells like these do leave you open and susceptible to hand traps, but at the same time, your deck can actually play cards like Cyframe Gana, and you can also actually play cards like Solemn Strike to actually counteract the hand traps that your opponent would use against you. And there also are some really cool old school cards, such as Soul Drain, that prevent your opponent from ever activating cards from hand to begin with, which is just something that you can keep in mind. It's honestly just food for thought. So moving forward, past that aspect, back to what I was saying about anti-meta, Barrier Statue is basically just a helmet dot deck. I wanted to put Barrier Statue to represent every anti-meta deck because it is the anti-meta strategy that is the most successful out of all. Evil Swarm is a really cool anti-meta strategy too, because there are certain times back in the day when everybody was summoning level 5 or higher monsters via special summoning. So a card like Evil Swarm Ophion was equivalent to a Barrier Statue, which basically says you cannot special summon. And for the most part, most decks actually special summon a lot. So Barrier Statue can be a hard counter to a lot of strategies, which is just something that you might want to try out because it's a good going first deck, but at the same time, you have to keep in mind that the deck is really weak going second. And so back to the deck building thing. So when you're building a deck, not only am I saying keep in mind how many spells, traps, and monsters you run, take into consideration, do you want your deck to be built going first or do you want it to be built going second? Each deck, each playstyle has its ups and downs and each one has an advantage over the other. I wouldn't say that one is better than the other because you can win going first and at the same time you can win going second. So I can't really say that going second is better than going first, even though you do get that one extra card going second. If you choose to go second against a deck that plays a lot of traps or a lot of control that can't really be negated by a hand trap, you're basically playing into that board, which means that cards in your hand will be accounted for and answered to other cards that your opponent has set face down. So if your opponent activates a card like Solemn Strike, Scolding, Warning, Bottomless, Trap Hole, Floodgate, Torrential, Compulse, Book of Moon, there's a lot of disruption staples. A card that you played from your hand that has now been negated by that trap has basically been thrown in the trash, and that is a resource that you cannot account for anymore because your opponent has answered. And in the cumulative balance, a cumulative advantage, if your opponent can account for each card in your hand and can answer 4 to 5 cards out of your hand, your opponent can put you at a position where now they have a monster on field, you have no cards left in hand, and that one monster is going to be the bane of your existence because it's going to continue attacking your life points. So if you're building your deck going first, keep in mind that you still want to main deck cards that can help you out if you happen to go second. So the best pieces of advice I could give to you pertaining to that actual subject, which is one of the sensitive subjects I mentioned in the beginning of the video, is that you really want to make your deck versatile. When I say versatile, I mean you don't want it to be linear. What is linear, 3-stack? Linear is really simple, dull, and one thing only. What does that mean? Zodiacs have a linear playstyle because they only XYZ summon. True Draco has a linear playstyle because it only tribute summon. It does one thing and it might do that thing so well that it does it better than any other deck. But there's no sophistication in your plays, and if your opponent can play a card like Mask of Restrict or an anti-XYZ summoning card, they basically shut your playstyle down, and because it's so linear and you play no alternative mechanics in form of summoning or even playstyle, you can be shut down by floodgates such as those cards. So you definitely don't want to build a linear deck. You want it to be as versatile as possible, and linear can go so far as to say your deck is linear because it can only go first. Barrier Statue is a great example. If you're playing Barrier Statue, you really can only go first. You can only do well if you're going first. So if you want to do well going second, you want to play cards like all of these hand traps that I have here, and you also want to main deck cards like Dark Hole, Raigeki, Kaiju Slumber. You can tech in Lava Golem or Roth Spear Mode. You can also tech in a card like Evenly Matched, which might be on the more expensive side, but nonetheless, if you can afford the card, it gives you a huge advantageous edge if you're forced to go second and you happen to draw the card. Another thing that you want to keep in mind is you want to play enough of those cards. If you just main deck one Dark Hole for going second, the odds of actually drawing that card are so low because Yu-Gi-Oh is a game of chance and there's also probability and statistics behind it. It's a science and also a math. So I say you want to play enough. You might want to contribute close to 1/4 of your deck to going second. For example, a deck that I play right now on a competitive scene, I actually main 3 Evenly Matched, Dark Hole and Raigeki, that's 5 cards already, 3 Joes, that's 8, 3 Ogres, that's 11, 3 Ash, that's 14, 3 Gammas, that's 17, Max C, that's 18 different cards that can help you out immensely if you happen to lose the dice roll and are forced to going second. That means half of your deck can be drawn to help you out. And at the same time, it could be bad because if you go first, you're left with these cards. But because they're so versatile, if you keep them in your hand and you happen to go first, you basically can use them to stop your opponent from ever establishing himself. So it can be used on the flip side as well. But I would say you want to build your deck for going first and second. So I recommend you play cards like Solemn Strike, Solemn Scolding, Warning, Bottomless, Torrential, perhaps Mirror Forces. You want to play Evenly Matched. You can main deck floodgates such as Anti-Spell. If your deck does not really play so many spells, you can actually take advantage of that and main deck cards like this. If your deck doesn't play any traps, you can main deck a card like Royal Decree for decks that do play traps, and it has zero hindrance to you, but probably more than a minuscule hindrance on your opponent, which is really nice. And at the same time, you know what? It never hurt. And that's why cards like that are so good. But nonetheless, outside of going first and going second, in terms of consistency, where are we at currently on the video? Let's see. We are currently staying at 24 minutes. All right. In terms of consistency, cards that search and draw are basically consistent cards. And also consistency can go so far as to how many of the card are you playing and how many ways to get into that card are you playing. So the best example is the field spells. If you don't play a deck that plays field spells, you can actually play generic draw powers such as Pot of Desires. If your deck happens to not normal summon so heavily, you can play cards like the Spellbook Engine and use your normal summon on the Spellbook Magician to draw. So +1s matter too as well. And that's another topic that we might be able to touch before this video ends, because we're doing a segment number 2 after that. But in terms of consistency, you definitely want to have some way, shape, or form to actually get you some form of advantage, because if your deck has no way to search or draw, whatever hand you draw is the hand you get. So if you draw a bad hand, there's no way to fix that. So you basically could lose by default of your own deck, which kind of sucks. So you really do want to play some form of, a plus or a searching. Pot of Desires is the most diverse and also the most generic +1 that any deck can play. It comes at the downside, but you can also cater your deck's build to playing a card like this and run 3 of every single copy of the 3 copies of every single card that is important to you. And the cards that aren't important to you, you probably won't care if they get banished. A +1 does matter, and for those of you who do not know what a +1 is, or a plus in general, plussing means that you end with more than what you started. So if you play a card like Upstart and you still end with 5 cards in hand, you did not plus. But since Pot of Desires is a card you play from your hand, which puts you minus a card and draws you 2, it's not a +2 because 1 card you drew paid for the desires, and the second card is an extra card that you never had to start with. And drawing multiple cards is really good, because when you draw 1, it's not so good, but when you draw 2, you have a higher chance of drawing a better hand in general. So Pot of Desires is a staple that every and any deck can actually play. It's one of the best spells that, Konami has ever printed. Touching the matter of field spells, there are different field spells that actually play in different ways. Some field spells have effects when they're activated, and if you have a deck that plays field spells like these, when they're activated, they cannot be answered to cards like Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit, because it's a when it's activated effect, which means even though it is face up on the field, it was not face up on the field when the card activated this effect. And cards like Draconic Diagram are susceptible to Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit, but at the same time, it has no cost, so the drawback is very minimal for you. It basically becomes a card for card exchange. 1 card from your hand for 1 card from your opponent's hand, which means nobody's really winning, but at the same time, you're being slowed down. Cards like Ritual Sanctuary, who come with a cost, can be a lot more detrimental if your opponent happens to negate it or Ghost over it, because you have to pay the cost of a card effect whether you resolve it or not. So field spells with the cost and spells with the cost in general are some of the worst spells you can play, but most cards that come with the cost actually are so powerful, they can be blowout bombshells if they get to resolve, such as Desires and Ritual Sanctuary. Now, cards like Spellbook of Knowledge, Terraforming, Pre-Prep, and also Duelist Alliance are basically searcher cards that are kind of specific, meaning you have to play the cards that they search. And that also comes at the downside drawback, which means if you already drew the card that they search, they can be dead cards in hand, but they come at a very, very advantageous benefit, because if you have these cards in deck that they search, you basically open up with a way to get to the cards you needed for free without actually drawing the card itself, which could actually be beneficial to you. And at the same time, even though they're specific, cater to certain playstyles, these cards cannot be specific whatsoever, such as this in a spellcaster deck, this in a deck that plays field spells, Pre-Prep in a deck that plays rituals who have the specific name listed in the spell, and Duelist Alliance basically being for pendulum decks. So these spells are amazing, and these kind of cover the category of consistency that I was getting at. I'm going to double check where we are for time. Boom, we are at 28 minutes. So explaining summoning mechanics really quick before we move on to the second segment of the video is there are a lot of benefits that come to each summoning mechanic. So if you're building a deck that's catered to one summoning mechanic only, that it will be a linear playstyle. So even though the deck might do it so well, you're leaving yourself susceptible to floodgates. Unfortunately, Konami made a way to counter every single summoning mechanic. There's a way to counter XYZ summoning. There's actually cards that prevent you from XYZ summoning in general, such as Flying Sea, etc. There's even cards such as XYZ Universe that can really blow you out the water. There are actually anti-link strategies. There are cards that prevent you from synchro summoning whatsoever. There are cards that can actually prevent you from ever fusion summoning. There are cards that can prevent you from either ritual summoning or actually tributing monsters in general. So Mask of Restrict actually can restrict you from ritual summoning and tribute summoning. And there are also cards that keep you from pendulum summoning whatsoever. And Dimensional Barrier covers a lot of the actual linear playstyles such as XYZ, Pendulum, Ritual, and Fusion and Synchro, which is really, really important because that is such a powerful card in general. The only mechanics that don't get shut down by D-Barrier are Link Summoning and actually Tribute Summoning. So if you're playing a deck that can perform multiple summoning mechanics, you are not susceptible to cards such as Dimensional Barrier, Mask of Restrict, Flying Sea, etc., etc. So that's also something you want to keep in mind when you're building your deck, that you don't want it to lose to certain cards like that. Even if they're not popular, you never know who's playing it. You never know what people are preparing for. So with that said, I'll definitely say this. If you play decks that can actually XYZ summon, you probably have a huger edge over any of the other summoning mechanics because Konami has actually printed so many generic XYZs that if you play rank 4s, you have access to cards like Baguska, Abyss Dweller, Utopia the Lightning, Breaksword, and True King of All Calamities. If your deck can make these cards, you have a huge advantage over the other player, because if they can't make these cards, you basically have an advantage over them and basically a beneficial accoutrement that they cannot capitalize off of, and also at the same time that they have no access to. If you're playing Links are actually a bit more abusive because you can link summon with anything. XYZs can only be used on levels and not ranks, so you can basically XYZ summon with anything except the link. You can link summon with anything, and synchro summoning is a little bit trickier because you have to have the right levels. But synchro summoning has an edge over XYZ summoning because most synchro monsters have effects that are longevity. You know, XYZ monsters basically have detach effects, so once they run out of materials, they're basically normal monsters. Fusion monsters are pretty cool because a lot of them have really, really diverse effects similar to synchro summoning. And I think if your deck can play cards like Dark Law, you really have a huge advantage over other. Ritual summoning is actually the least most popular of all summoning mechanics because it's just a difficult mechanic in general to fulfill. And for the most part, most decks have, no way to really ritual summon consistently. And at the same time, if they can drop one, they normally aren't able to drop another one. So ritual summoning is one of the most unpopular, if not the least popular, of all summoning mechanics. Tribute summoning is something that every deck can fulfill, but there's no real good tribute summoning monsters outside of the Draco monsters and the Monarchs themselves. And also, Pendulum summoning is pretty particular to its own archetype. For the most part, if you're playing Pendulums, you're probably playing an entire Pendulum deck. That's just how specific they are. So generic summoning mechanics are good, but there are some that a lot of decks can't play. And I think if you play a deck that can Ritual, Fusion, Synchro, and Link summon, you actually have a huge advantage because there are generic there are generic XYZs, generic Synchros, generic Fusions that you can summon off of instant fusions that you can play in your deck that can be bombshells in any matchup. So if you want to, in terms of summoning mechanics, when you build your deck, you want to build your deck with as many summoning mechanics as possible without taking away from the playstyle and the center focal point of the deck. I'm actually going to continue to the second segment and continue on distributing the information that I have for you guys. So I'm actually going to sign out right here